So you've never heard of a TwUberfour before, much less seen one? Well, there's a first time for everything. And when I needed a couple of uber long 2x4s on a recent project, I set about making a couple of these already, and the process was kind of fun, and the end result is somewhat fascinating. So I decided to do a video to tell you what a TwUberfour is. And in my definition, a TwUberfour is anything over the normal 16-foot maximum length that you can buy at a lumberyard. And this one is a full 22 feet long. And until somebody else accepts the challenge, I'm going to make the claim that this is the longest 2x4 on YouTube. Now that you know what a TwUberfour is, and you've seen what one looks like, let me show you how to make one. Because length is lost by using the special scarf joint that I'll use to make this 22-foot long TwUberfour, I'm starting out with two 2x4s that are 12 feet long each, so that I end up with a total of 22 feet with a 2-foot overlap on the special scarf joint. I start by extending my work surface to a full 24 feet by lining up my table saw with the workbench on that end and lining up one of my special GROAT tangent ramp outfeed roller stands on this end so that I can line the boards up for a better grain match and for layout marks of the special scarf joint. The scarf joint is super simple to lay out, and as I mentioned earlier, I'll have a 2-foot overlap of these two pieces. Now I've done a little bit of flipping and flopping of these pieces to get a nice grain match so that the special scarf joint kind of goes away when this is all done. After going through various options for laying out this splice, I decided to cut a wedge off this corner of this piece and a wedge off of that corner of that piece. And let's just do a simple layout using a tape measure to lay out the 24-inch length of the scarf joint here. And by sliding one piece next to the other, I can lay out the same 24 inches on both pieces. Because a scarf joint is basically just a tapered wedge cut here, I'm using a straight edge to connect the end and the edge of this piece with the precise point of that 24-inch mark on this piece. Just like that. And a sharp Next Level Carpentry pencil gives me a crisp, clean mark for the scarf joint angle cut. And naturally, I repeat the layout process on the mating end of the other 2x4. And keep in mind that the accuracy of the layout and cuts on each of these pieces determine how straight the TwUberfour is when the splice is complete. The next step before rough cutting the scarf joint is to make a fixture for flush trimming the scarf joint after it's rough cut. And I'll do that by temporarily attaching a straight edge to this edge of the 2x4. And I do that by spritzing the edge of the 2x4 with Star-Bond accelerator and applying some dabs of the thick CA glue to the edge of the straight edge. Once the straight edge is temporarily stuck to the edge of the 2x4, I tack a couple of trim nails exactly on the edge of the scarf joint layout line to help with alignment as I finish the jig. To finish the jig, I spray the whole backside of the top template piece with Star-Bond accelerator and add a strip of the flexible medium thick CA to the straight edge. With accelerator and CA applied, all I need to do to finish up this little routing fixture is to line up the top template piece with the finish nails on the scarf joint layout line and hold the two pieces in place for about 20 seconds while the CA glue sets. And that's all it takes to make this flush trim routing template. So I can finish up by cleaning off little splinters of wood and glue from the straight edge so that the business edge of the template lines up perfectly with the layout mark for the scarf joint cut. And that cleanup is super quick and easy to do using a sharp chisel with the fixture clamped in the bench habit. And you can see that the finished fixture works equally well on both sides of that scarf joint, so that when everything is complete, the TwUberfour will be very straight through the joint. The last thing this routing fixture gets is a hole drilled with a Forstner bit near the skinny end for applying clamp pressure when flush trimming the scarf joint to a feather thin point. With the TwUberfour scarf joint flush trim routing jig complete, I'll use my Makita 6.5 inch 18 bolt lithium iron cordless saw to rough cut the scarf joint about an 1/8 inch proud of the layout line shown earlier. I cut closer to this line than I intended, but that's no big deal because I can use the scarf joint flush trim routing jig as a guide to redraw the pencil line for jig placement and flush trimming. Using this flush trim routing jig is a pretty simple ordeal. Just use a piece of spec tape, double-sided adhesive tape on the workpiece, and then stick the routing jig into place with the straight edge of the jig along the straight layout line on the edge of the workpiece. And my router of choice for this kind of procedure is this de-handled Bosch that they no longer make, but it's a great machine. And my router bit of choice is this Whiteside Monster here, which is their 3018 pattern bit. It's got a 1/2 inch shank, top bearing, and a full 1.5 inch cut length, so it'll flush trim the whole face of that 2x4 in one pass. It's kind of a noisy process, but you can tell by the shavings that this bit is super sharp. It makes quick work of the flush trimming process. And you can see that this 2x4 is just a little bit thicker than 1.5 inches because that bit is leaving a flange on the top and the bottom edges of the workpiece with a single pass. Notice I stopped the flush trimming process short of the feather end of this piece, and that's so I can add a clamp to secure the jig to the workpiece down at the feather end, where there's very little spec tape holding the two together. And that is all there is to flush trimming that face. As I set up to do the second workpiece, I adjust my settings a little bit so that the first pass flush trims all the way to the top of the workpiece for a cleaner fit when these pieces come together. Then I follow up with a second pass and the same bit setting to finish the flush trim process. Once the routing is done, I use a sharp block plane to fine-tune the joint for a perfect fit when it comes time for glue up. And that is marvelous. And I think you'll agree that when I dry fit this scarf joint, that is already a pretty sweet fit. Because a good glue joint is always stronger than the wood itself, and there's so much surface area on this scarf joint. You can see how strong it is here just with a couple of clamps. I could probably get away with just gluing the joint and have it be plenty strong enough, but I want to make sure this TwUberfour is uber strong, so I'm going to take the strength up a level by adding a custom biscuit or a spline to the joint to make sure the board is as strong as it can be from the get-go. I could probably get a similar result for strength in the joint by using 2 rows of biscuits along both faces of the scarf joint, but I decided to make what amounts to an elongated biscuit out of this piece of 6mm Russian birch plywood because, well, just because I can. Plus, I think it'll be stronger in the long run. I start by making sure that the scarf joint itself is exactly 24 inches long, and I put a mark right at the very center of those faces, and then square up the mark with a little sweet square from Greg's Garage on YouTube, so that I have marks to use for alignment when I ultimately glue up the joint, and to make sure that the spline is centered up in the length of the scarf joint for proper alignment during glue up. As I said, this spline is 6mm thick, it's 14 inches long, and it's just a little less than 1 inch wide at 15/16 of an inch. And I want to make sure that the slot is centered up in between the two faces when I route it. So I square up the center mark and put a mark approximately at both ends of the spline to make sure the slot is routed long enough, but not too long. because if the slot goes too far, it'll show up on the outside of the TwUberfour, which is something I want to avoid. I'll use this slot cutting bit in the same router to make the slot for the spline. And the best way to do that is to use a slot cutter that's slightly narrower than the spline itself, so that I can route the spline slot from both faces of the TwUberfour so that a slot of exactly the right width is exactly centered between the two faces on both faces of the scarf joint. And this particular router bit is 4.8 millimeters, so it's slightly less than the 6 or so millimeters in the thickness of this Russian birch plywood. I used a double square to guesstimate the width and the location of the slot on the edge of one of the cut-off pieces from the scarf joint, and then set the height of the router bit close to those marks, and then dial in the slot width on this test piece by routing from both faces and adjusting the bit depth until the spline fits snugly in the slot. My first attempt is not bad, but it's a little bit loose, so I lower the bit a bit and do a test run on the other scrap. And that's the kind of fit that I'm after. So it's good to go. I want good support for the router base as I route these spline slots, so I just use a piece of green frog tape to tape the cutoff scrap to the back side of the workpiece to hold it in place while I route the slot, and I use a piece of scrap here as a backstop to keep the piece from moving as I carefully route from both faces between this mark and this mark for the full length of the spline slot. And this is a little tricky because I've got to flip the piece end for end and top for bottom for a good stance while routing the slot from both faces in both directions. And that's the kind of fit I want to end up with, where the center mark is buried in the slot so that I know the width of the spline won't hold the joint apart during glue up. The second verse is the same as the first, and it takes just a few minutes to route perfect spline slots in both faces of the 24-inch long scarf joint for this 22-foot long TwUberfour. You can see when I stop halfway through the second pass that second pass doesn't remove much material. And if my metric calculations are correct, it's removing about 1.2 millimeters more material, so the finished slot is the correct width. And you can get a pretty good idea of the strength and viability of a joint like this when I pull off the scrap support pieces, slip the spline into place, and dry fit the joint. Because with nothing more than a snug fitting joint and a little clamp pressure, I already have what amounts to a viable TwUberfour, and this baby's 22 feet long. Oh yeah. Now that dry fit of the joint is complete and copacetic, I can butter this up with some Titebond 2 glue to make this splined scarf joint all it can be. I put a generous coat of the Titebond 2 glue on all the adjoining surfaces to make sure there's no dry spots in the joint, and then flip one of the pieces over to fit the joint and distribute the glue. Then once I'm satisfied with distribution of the glue, I lay the pieces flat, make sure the center marks are lined up perfectly, and use 4 clamps to distribute equal clamping pressure for the full length of the splined scarf joint. The rubber jawed squeeze clamps provide nice even clamping pressure on the thin ends of the scarf joint, and the Irwin F-style screw clamps apply excellent pressure along the main body of the joint where the spline is. Once clamps are in place and screw pressure is applied, I use sawdust, aka guy glitter, to soak up the excess glue squeeze out and clean up the joint while the glue is fresh. And that's because I got to make it easy on myself, because no one is going to do it for me. And I'm not even going to tell you what I said to the last person I saw using warm water and wet rags to clean up glue squeeze out on a project in the Next Level Carpentry shop. But I will tell you that I didn't encourage him to do it again. And now, while that glue sets up, I'll share a word from my sponsor, except I don't have a sponsor. So I'll just ask that if you like videos like this with unusual content from the shop of a master carpenter, I'll ask you to hit the subscribe button for Next Level Carpentry if you haven't already. Subscriber count has been increasing slowly but steadily, and that's a good thing. So while you're at it, please hit that thumbs up button with something. Hit it with a brush or a hammer, or smash it with a clamp, but hit the like button because that helps promote videos from Next Level Carpentry to a wider audience, which leads to more subscribers, which I appreciate. And even though I don't have a specific sponsor for this video, I do have affiliates that I work with on a fairly regular basis. One of them being Starbond CA glues that you saw in use earlier in this video, making the flush trimming router template. And there's also tools and supplies that you see used in this and other Next Level Carpentry videos. And there's links to those at Amazon in the video description below. I'm also a passive affiliate of my friends at Acme Tools, where I've got some of the bigger pieces of equipment in the shop. And another way to support the channel here is to go to Teespring through the link in the video description for t-shirts like this one. And also, I recently renewed the listing for the fun DeWalt BS1000 board stretcher line of swag that you can find there through that link to Spring. And although it's going to take a little while longer for that glue to set and dry, I don't want to get back to work without mentioning my appreciation for the Patreon audience of Next Level Carpentry, where a dedicated group of viewers and patrons support video production with content like this that you get to see free of charge on YouTube. And they do that with regular generous support as patrons of the channel on Patreon. So if you appreciate content like this, want to join that group, check out the link to Patreon in the video description. And because I don't have to kowtow to some demanding sponsor for this or any other video here at Next Level Carpentry, I can wrap up this infomercial, let the glue dry, and fire up the camera again when it's time to remove those clamps and check out a genuine 22-foot long TwUberfour. After giving the glue in this splined scarf joint more than enough time to dry, I can pop the clamps off here, give it a quick belt stand for cosmetic purposes, and then we'll see about a stress test. Although I'm not standing here to tell you that this is a structurally sound TwUberfour, but I will tell you that the scarf joint is one of the stronger sections of the entire 22-foot length. And I think you'll agree that that is a pretty sweet looking scarf joint, grain match and all. Granted, as always, there's an A side and a B side, but for a piece of construction lumber, this TwUberfour is acceptable. And you can see, after just a little bit of cosmetic sanding, that that joint not only looks good, but it's plenty strong for being in the center of a very long board. I'm looking at the full length of this 22-foot TwUberfour from the very end. You can see it's arrow straight, and the splined scarf joint is virtually invisible from the end. And that completes my entry into the longest 2x4 on YouTube contest, which no one entered but me. And I'll wrap up by saying, as always, and until next time, thanks for watching. Unofficial analytics tell me that anyone who's still watching a Next Level Carpentry video at the end is a bit of an outlier in the YouTube audience in general. And as outliers, viewers that are still here are pretty observant and are probably wondering about unusual camera angles in this video, as well as a change in the wall colors in the Next Level Carpentry shop. Well, as a reward for hanging around to the end of this video, I'll give you a little bit of insight into the TwUberfour itself and a bit of backstory into those other changes you see. The main driver behind the changes here in the Next Level Carpentry shop is this. This is an articulating camera boom arm that I made over the past 6 weeks or so to help with video production by allowing quicker and better camera positioning for shooting video here in the shop. And this is less of a surprise to patrons than it is to regular viewers because the project has been a work in progress, but I finally got it to the point where it's functional, and this is the first YouTube video that I've used the arm for shooting various clips in the video. All the joints in this arm are articulated for camera positioning, which really helps in the process. And one of the more significant features of the camera boom arm is that it's mounted on a gantry. So not only do I have infinite control of positioning of the camera itself by these articulating joints here on the ends and the articulation in the arm, but the gantry itself allows me to position the camera virtually anywhere in the 3D space of the entire shop, floor to ceiling, side to side, and end to end. And I'm telling you all this for a couple reasons. And the first one is that the next video from Next Level Carpentry on YouTube is going to be a more in-depth build video for the camera arm and the gantry. And another one is that the 2 pieces of wood that I screwed to the ceiling to mount this gantry track to needed to be a little less than 22 feet long. And because I have to put that up by myself, I decided to make those single pieces by using a splined scarf joint, hence the TwUberfour scenario. And I thought, as long as I'm doing this, I'll shoot a video because it's kind of fun making that uber long 2x4. And I figured while I'm at it, I had to screw those 2x4s to the ceiling. I also needed to repaint this shop for quite a while. So that's why the wall colors are changed. And I just decided to paint the ceiling and this wall and the accent wall there before installing the gantry track and the camera boom arm. And even though I'm not completely sure what on earth I'm going to do with a 22-foot long TwUberfour going forward, I do know that I want to thank you for sticking around for this little bit of insight at the end of the end of the end. And I'll look forward to hanging out with you in the growing end of the end of the end video club here at Next Level Carpentry.